Dan Clayton's back with us. Hey, Dan.
Hey, guys. How you doing? Sorry about the technical difficulties there.
Hey, no worries. Good. You know, the craziest thing is the last time we talked to you was in March, as the Jazz were kind of getting ready here for what we would call a playoff push in March.
Yeah.
And now we're back playing they got back on Saturday playing the Oklahoma City Thunder in really disappointing fashion. What did you see was the biggest differences between Game 1 versus the Pelicans and Game 2 versus the Thunder?
I mean, all due respect to New Orleans, opponent quality had a big part to do with it. Oklahoma City is just, look, they're smart. They are, every time throughout the course of the season, because I do graphics and stuff for Salt City Hoops to kind of track the Western Conference playoff race, every time Oklahoma City goes on this major tear where they win 8 out of 10 or something, I always go check to see, like, okay, who's playing out of their mind and facilitating that? And what's crazy is, the answer is usually nobody. Like, it's just that they've got a lot of quality guys who are smart at basketball, know how to play their roles. Chris Paul is obviously a wizard. He's 35 years old, but he's still just controlling the game at a really high level. I think, if I remember correctly, I think Oklahoma City outscored the Jazz by 27 points just in Chris Paul's minutes. So, first of all, you have to tip the hat and give Oklahoma City credit where that's concerned. But really, I think the other big part of the difference from Utah's end, from Utah's perspective, is I just don't think they were playing as smart, particularly in pick and roll situations. On Thursday night, the opener, the reopener, I guess, the first game of the restart for Utah against New Orleans, I thought Donovan Mitchell was fantastic in pick and roll. He was coming off screens and just making really good reads, and, the ball was going the right places. And then Saturday against Oklahoma City, again, a better team, a team that knows how to scheme for a specific opponent. I just felt like they were doing things to sort of speed up Donovan Mitchell's decision-making process, and that was causing him and other people to just do things that were a little out of character and try to do too much, and it was really, like, literally, it was one of Utah's 5 worst offensive performances of the entire season.
How much of it was also just the second game? Everybody was amped for the first game. Oklahoma City, that was their first game, and for the Utah Jazz, it was, they don't have a lot of time to prepare for the next opponent. There's just some film study. You can't do a lot of walkthroughs. How much is just the timing of when things happen for each team?
Yeah, I mean, it could be, right? Because, for ever since the NBA released the restart schedule, Oklahoma City has been thinking about, okay, our next game's against Utah, our next game's against Utah, our next game's against Utah, right? So, I mean, that could have something to do with it. Like I say, I think the Jazz know the Thunder pretty well. They've seen each other. That was the third time this season. They know Chris Paul because Chris Paul has been, someone they've been linked to in the playoffs for several seasons in when he was with LA and then when he was with Houston. So, like, they know these guys. They know how these guys like to play. I think the advanced scouting department for the Jazz does a pretty good job of equipping the players with a sense of what different guys want to do. So I do think that at a certain level, when you're at this level of the game and there's a finite number of teams and players that you're seeing all the time, a lot of it just comes down to you getting yourself mentally prepared for a particular opponent and then executing the way that you want to execute. And like I say, the Jazz just didn't seem to be able to do that, especially on the offensive end, where they just made a lot of bizarre, boneheaded decisions that you don't usually see from the Jazz. The Jazz since December have been one of the NBA's top offenses, so you just don't see them go into such an extended drought like that very often.
The Utah Jazz have been, from deep, have not been great, 24.6 percentage on 32.5 attempts per game. Is there a solution to this, or without Bojan, do they need to find a different way to score?
No, I think you're referring specifically to the 3-point line, right?
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, I think that's who they want to be. That's who they need to be. Because if you don't force teams to respect that, then the middle gets clogged up, and that means Rudy Gobert can't roll into the lane, and that means Donovan Mitchell can't drive, and that just impacts everything. So they need to still be able to get shots up, and Quinn Snyder's been talking about that over the course of the last week, just being willing to pull the trigger on good shots, right? Like, some of it is is you just need to be able to pass up an okay shot if there's a better shot coming later in the offense, later in the execution of the play. But that's going to still be really important to them, and they have several guys who can hit that. Joe Ingles is a really good shooter. Mike Conley can be. He's been off and on during his lone Jazz season. Royce O'Neal is better than people realize. Donovan Mitchell can get hot. Jordan Clarkson off the bench. George Niang suddenly can't hit a shot to save his life in Orlando. But before these last two games, he's been a really good shoot. I mean, that's his one NBA skill, or at least his top NBA skill is the ability to space the floor with three-point shooting. And suddenly that's not there for him. So, I do think it'll come back for him and some other guys. I think some of it, again, is patience, and some of it is that without Bojan and just the spacing threat that Bojan Bogdanovic adds, they might just be threes that are a little bit more pressured than the Jazz are used to, right? I mean, the Jazz had great spacing when they had multiple, the Jazz started the season, if you think about it, Conley, Bogey, and Donovan Mitchell. They started the season with three guys who have averaged 20 or more in a season before. So when you have that many scoring threats, everybody's going to be a little bit more comfortable. And I think some of it, to your question, is that the Jazz are just adjusting to that.
Again, we're talking to Dan Clayton with Salt City Hoops. One of the things that we were looking at when the NBA restart was going to be happening here is what type of team would do better with a shortened type of a lead up to when things happen. There's no home court. It doesn't matter.
Right.
A team that's more system oriented or a team that's more playground style, kind of like Houston.
Yeah.
Houston seems to be thriving right now, and the Jazz not so much.
Yeah, I mean, small sample size too, right? Houston's 2-0. Their win against Milwaukee looks pretty impressive, except that Milwaukee's doing some different things minutes wise because they more or less have their top seed locked up for the Eastern Conference playoffs. So, I mean, I do think that there's something to be said for, when nothing feels normal and you can't get into the rhythm the way that you normally do because there's not a crowd and there's not you're not at home with your family and then driving to the arena and doing the same routine that you do. Sometimes if you can't get into that rhythm and get things done that way, it helps if you've got guys who are just bucket getters, right? Guys who could just step onto the court at the YMCA or the local LDS meeting house and just be hot from the second they step on the court. And, Harden's one of those guys, and that's certainly part of why Houston is doing well. Harden had one amazing game, and then he had one game where he kind of struggled, but they won anyway. Like I say, though, the Jazz have a couple of guys like that. Even with Bojan out, they've got Donovan Mitchell and Mike Conley, who have both been the number one guy in the past. So, I think ultimately the Jazz will be okay. I don't know if they have enough firepower to really be contenders in this summer playoff, but I do think that I do think they're a lot better than they showed on Saturday. Let me put it that way. And I think that how far they go is really going to become a question of how much Donovan Mitchell and Mike Conley can do offensively, and then obviously how dominant Rudy Gobert can be on defense.
Jazz Lakers tonight at 7 o'clock. That's on ESPN. Dan, the Lakers defense has been better in the bubble than it was during their season, I guess in average regard. Give me one number for the Utah Jazz that gives you hope that maybe the Jazz could get over the Lakers.
A number, huh? I mean, honestly, it's going to have to be the 3-point line. I think that's what it's going to have to be. So the Lakers and the Jazz have actually, from a roster perspective, they have the exact opposite problem right now. So the Lakers were already short on guard play, on like ball handling guards all season long. And then Rajon Rondo is hurt, and he's going to miss 6 to 8 weeks, so most or all of the bubble environment. And then Avery Bradley opted to not participate in the bubble for health reasons, family reasons, all of that. So that leaves them really without a true point guard. LeBron James basically is their point guard, but that means LeBron James has to be the initiator of the offense. He has to get the gears turning on a lot of plays. He has to be the end point of the offense too. So it's just a big role, a lot for LeBron to do in his mid-30s. So that's kind of their issue, is that they have They just are really low on guards, and particularly ball-moving guards. The Jazz's problem is that they've got a lot of ball handlers, but especially with Bojan out, they just don't have a lot of rotation-capable big men, right? So most of their bubble minutes have been Rudy Gobert with 4 guards. Or, if you call Royce O'Neal a big, then Rudy, Royce, and 3 guards. But that's going to be a problem when you're facing a team who can put, Dwight Howard at center, Anthony Davis at power forward, a couple of high-quality wings, and then LeBron as the de facto point guard. Like, how do you deal with that size when you've got, Jordan Clarkson at 6'0" to throw at them, or Mike Conley at 6'1", or, it's just, so size is going to be an issue for the Jazz. And I really do think that the only way that they come away with a win tonight is if they get hot from the outside. So that's my offensive version of answering your question. I think they need to shoot like 40% or better from 3. And then on the defensive end, Rudy Gobert has to do a decent job of keeping LA's bigs off the rim.
We'll be cheering for him.
Yeah.
Good luck.
It's a tall task, man. It's a tall task. If there's any silver lining, it's that, like I just said about Milwaukee and their game against Houston, LA pretty much has the number 1 seed sewn up. Technically, they haven't clinched it yet, but they'll clinch it the next time they win or the Clippers lose. So, sometimes the team that needs it more badly is the team that wins in these down the stretch games. So maybe the Lakers will put their feet up at some point, and the Jazz will be hungry because they're in a real dogfight for the 3 through 6 seeds in the West, which, those 4 teams, it's currently Denver, Houston, OKC, and Utah. Those 4 teams are just really going to be fighting it out until the very, very end of these seeding games.
Okay, I wanted to talk about seeding with you. Without home court meaning anything, it doesn't really matter so much about where you're seated. Is it better for the Jazz to maybe say, we're going to play for matchups and we're okay with being a 6th seed, or do they want to still try to compete for that 4, hold on to the 4, or maybe even knock off Denver for the 3?
It's a fascinating question this year in particular, because like if you're the 4th seed, you're like, okay, congratulations. Technically, we're an overseed. Technically, we're a home court team, but we're not really, right? Like, because if you're that team, you still have to play in a gym in Orlando. It's not like you're flying back to your own gym to play that game. And then your reward for being the 4th seed as opposed to being the 6th seed is that you get the Lakers in the second round, right? So I do think that there's an argument to be made for this year, the 6 being a better playoff spot than the 4, right? Because either way, you're going to play one of those 4 teams. Your first round opponent, if you're 3 through 6, is going to be one of Houston, Denver, Utah, OKC, 4 teams that I believe are pretty roughly, in macro quality, they're pretty roughly equal. I mean, obviously, certain matchups are more favorable to certain teams, but, at a high level, those are 4 teams that are pretty much have the same record and pretty much have been the same tier all season long. And then, if you're 6, then you get to avoid the Lakers in the second round, and instead you'll be playing the Clippers, who are also a really good team, but just haven't had the same juggernaut status all year as the Lakers.
Well, and how much of it is just avoid Houston?
Yeah, I mean, for the Jazz, certainly I think there's that playoff demon of Houston involved. I don't know. Personally, I think if I'm the Jazz, I wouldn't be as scared of Houston as I would be of the Lakers or Clippers. I view Houston as a team that is roughly in the Jazz's same stratosphere. They're a tough matchup for any reason, but any of those other 3 teams are a tough matchup for the Jazz, just because you're talking about teams that are roughly as good as you, and they can get hot at the right moment. And Denver does some things that cause the Jazz to struggle, which is why the Jazz are 0-2 against Denver this year. They're 1-2 against Oklahoma City this year because Oklahoma's smart and well coached and has a brilliant point guard at the center of their offense. And they're 1-2 against the Houston Rockets, the lone win being a Bojan Bogdanovic prayer at the buzzer. So, I mean, it's going to be tough no matter who you get. So I think the counter argument is you might as well go into the playoffs playing your best basketball. and feeling like you have some momentum and that you've treated the basketball gods correctly and that they owe you some good karma. But I really don't know. To your point, this is a year that I think you could certainly make the argument because, being the 4 seed doesn't put you in a much better position than being the 6 seed this particular season.
With this, the way the awards work for the Defensive Player of the Year, MVP and such, they've already been decided because of the regular season. Do you think that was fair, or should they have waited till after the restart was completed? Would it have changed your mind at all, the way things are going?
I don't like it at all. I don't like it at all because I think these 8 games that every team is playing are pretty important games to how their season's going to shake out. I get why they did it. They did it because they wanted to be fair to the 8 non-participating teams, to the guys from those teams, because, to anybody on those teams who might have still been part of the 6th Man of the Year race or the Defensive Player of the Year race, to watch their competitors get to go out and keep building their resume for that particular award didn't feel fair to the NBA. I would argue that, hey, if you were not within 6 games of the playoffs on March 11th, you probably weren't a front runner for major awards anyway, right? So I kind of wish that they had let this play out. I mean, for example, let's take Coach of the Year, right? Because I think most people for Coach of the Year were struggling with like Nick Nurse because Toronto has overperformed, Billy Donovan because OKC has really overperformed. Well, don't you think it would don't you think it would change your vote to know whether Billy Donovan's Thunder finished 6th in the West or 3rd in the West? Or would it matter if Toronto was number 2 instead of number 4? Or I do think those things matter to voters, and I think most voters I've heard from and read their thoughts on this subject wish they had the extra data points because these 8 games matter. This is practically a play-in tournament for most teams. Maybe not for the Lakers and Bucks, who already had done a lot of the work by March 11th to be in the position that they're in and to be in the catbird seat, but especially for, Jazz, Thunder, Raptors, Sixers, Celtics. I mean, a lot of teams are still battling it out in games that frankly matter more than whatever happened on a random Tuesday night in December. So I wish these games were part of the award voting, personally.
Speaking of Rudy Gobert, if he doesn't win Defensive Player of the Year, this is where you're so damn good at your job, Dan. If he doesn't win Defensive Player of the Year but makes an All-NBA team first, second, or third, is he still available for a Supermax contract? And how can the Jazz, if he is, make that happen financially? Or can they?
Yeah, so the short answer is yes, he's already eligible. Even if he doesn't win a single award this year, he's already locked in eligibility for the Supermax for this summer. Now, if they wanted to do something next summer, then yeah, he has to earn some additional awards before he qualifies. But as for right now, they could walk up to him with a Supermax offer this summer, regardless of anything that happens with award season. The question of, should they and will they and can they, that's a bit more complicated. They certainly can. The NBA's salary cap rules make it so that you can offer your player their, if you own their full rights, and the Jazz have full rights to Rudy Gobert's, contract situation. If you own their rights, you can pay to keep your player for any amount up to their maximum salary, which in his case would be the Supermax. So there's nothing that would stop the Jazz from doing it. It just might make the books tight in terms of, compiling and building the rest of their roster. I don't think there's a consensus on this one, which is crazy to me, by the way, because I am one of those people who firmly believes that Rudy Gobert is a top 10, 12, 15 player in the NBA. How can you be the best player in the NBA for 2 seasons straight at something that encompasses 50% of the game? And by the way, he's also pretty dang good and impactful on the offensive end of the court too. But I think he's a top 15 player. All NBA voters agree with me, right? Because he's been All NBA for 2 seasons now. So, if you're a top 15 player, I think that's exactly the type of player who you rush to give them as much money as you can, as early as you can, because it's kind of impact that you don't want to lose, and it's really hard to replace or replicate. But I've heard a really mixed set of signals coming from the punditry on this one. I think there are a lot of people who feel like locking up a defensive star is not quite the same as locking up an offensive star, and that if the Jazz did that, they'd be really hamstrung and in a rough situation. Although, again, the rules allow them to extend Donovan Mitchell, retain Rudy Gobert, and keep building their roster. Just doing so might become really costly for a small market team.
Dan, always great stuff. Appreciate the insights. We'll see how the Jazz do against the Lakers tonight and continue to keep an eye on how they do in the bubble, and we'll try to catch up with you again as they continue to play down in Orlando.
Great. Yeah, let's do it.
All right. Thanks, Dan.
Thanks, fellas.
Dan Clayton with Salt City Hoops.
So good.
Always great insight about the Utah Jazz.